I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, a sweet ending for the Muslim teenager handcuffed and suspended for bringing a homemade clock to class.
California voters may see a new ballot measure next year to abolish the death penalty. I'm Peggy Pico with how it's different from the last one. Then, Balboa Park centennial celebrations wrap up in a few months. What's the next 100 years going to look like?
Sometimes they just get overloaded with them. They're like, you know what, I'm just going to reject my language. And they're rejecting this gift.
Bringing the beat to bilingual education, the self-proclaimed crazy gringo who is taking his musical lessons on tour. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Aftershocks continue to rattle Chile after a powerful 8.3 quake hit the northern part of the country. At least 10 people were killed. 1 million people were forced out of their homes last night. The quake hit nearly 200 miles north of the capital, Santiago. It was felt in Sao Paulo, Brazil, more than 2,100 miles away. The quake prompted authorities here in the U.S. to warn swimmers and surfers out of the water. A tsunami advisory for the Southern California coastline has been canceled. It covered San Onofre State Beach up to Ragged Point, 50 miles northwest of San Luis Obispo. Experts say some areas may still see sea level change and unusual currents. A sigh of relief for investors and consumers. For now, the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates at record lows in the face of threats from a weak global economy and unstable financial markets. Fed officials said today, while the U.S. job market was stable, global developments like China's economic slowdown may hurt. Analysts say the Fed is expected to raise its key short-term rate by the end of the year. Searching for evidence of an economic recovery when it comes to San Diego's poverty rate, a new report out shows the number of San Diegans living below the federal poverty line last year remained steady. The CPI crunched the numbers, showing more than 15% of residents lived on less than $13,000 a year. Experts say the poverty rate stagnated despite an improving jobs picture. Nearly a quarter of African Americans and 23% of Latinos lived below the poverty line. The CPI, by the way, says a single person needs to earn at least $28,000 a year to make ends meet in San Diego with a no-frills budget. All clear at San Diego schools after authorities locked down 10 campuses. The security alert sent some parents scrambling to get their kids. KPBS reporter Steve Walsh shows us where police and school officials investigated threats of violence.
The calls started coming in just after 9:30 this morning in the San Diego Unified School District. School officials say there were threats of explosive devices placed in some buildings. Other threats referred to a potential shooter. As more calls came in, police and school officials ramped up their response.
As we started to get those calls into place, we had initially suggested the schools do a shelter in place while we sort of looked at what was the nature of the threats, what could we find out about what was coming in. We later asked the schools to put into place a lockdown given that we were starting to get more calls.
After the last call came in, a total of 10 of the city's 16 high schools were under lockdown. The Scripps Ranch, Patrick Henry, Mira Mesa, Morris, Claremont, Crawford, Kearney, San Diego, at Point Loma, and La Jolla. Worried parents congregated outside of Patrick Henry, including the father of a special needs student.
But, it's been a couple hours now, and you wonder how the kids are faring. Are they able to go to the bathroom? Are they able to eat anything? They're kids. So, I don't know.
A lot of anxiety right now.
Yes, a lot of uncertainty.
Police have not released details of their investigation. By 1:32, the last of the students had been released from lockdown. In June, a 15-year-old was arrested after calling in threats to Point Loma High School back in April. At the time, the teen was linked to an online gaming group which made threats to schools in several states and Canada. Steve Walsh, KPBS News.
The number of suicides fell in San Diego County last year. KPBS health reporter Kenny Goldberg says it's the first decline in suicide since 2010.
420 San Diegans took their own life last year. That's 21 fewer suicides than the county saw in 2013. Joe Davis is a chaplain with the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office. He lost his father to suicide 2 years ago. Davis has a message for people who think it will never happen to someone they know.
I've been 15 years as a medical examiner chaplain, helped hundreds and hundreds of families to the best of my ability, and I'm not immune from it. What makes you think you are?
The county has seen a rise in people seeking help. The number of calls to the local access and crisis line rose by 15% last year. Kenny Goldberg, KPBS News.
A new ballot initiative is being proposed to end California's death penalty. Peggy Pico finds out what's different about this measure.
The Justice That Works Act of 2016 measure is being proposed by anti-death penalty advocate actor Mike Farrell. Supporters must gather more than 365,000 signatures over the next 180 days for the bill to make the November 2016 ballot. California has not executed a prisoner in nearly a decade, and 740 convicts in the state are now on death row. Joining me with a look at the status of California's death penalty is my guest, Alex Simpson, Associate Director of the California Innocence Project at the California Western School of Law in San Diego. And Alex, if this new initiative to abolish the death penalty actually does qualify for the ballot, it'll be the first time since 2012 when a similar initiative failed by the voters just barely. What do you think has changed since then?
You know, I don't know that there's anything kind of in terms of the tenor or the tone of the conversation behind the death penalty between those two period of times, except that as the California's finances have gotten worse, the idea that we're spending millions of dollars on the death penalty and executing people is not as interesting, is not as favorable for even proponents of the death penalty. And so I think that might have been what's changed.
So this measure, again, the Justice That Works Act of 2016, what does it exactly propose?
Really, all it's saying is that for the people who are on death row, their sentences would be life without the possibility of parole, and that people going forward could not be sentenced to death, and the greatest sentence that you could get would be life without the possibility of parole. And really, as a practical matter, that is what happens in California, even for people who are sentenced to death.
They stay, you're saying that they stay alive, except that, what would you say to the people who say, well, sometimes people make mistakes? We've seen it on television where somebody's been acquitted of a death row conviction because new evidence, new DNA evidence has actually proved they're innocent.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of cases across the country where people have been exonerated from death row. And that really shows, I think, you know, the fact that we don't always get it right. There's nothing special about a death penalty case that means that we are more likely to actually get this right. So the people who are exonerated off of death row are really a testament to that.
Well, last year a federal judge ruled the death penalty is unconstitutional in California. Remind us of how the Judge Carney came to that ruling.
The judge really came to the conclusion that the death penalty was unconstitutional, not for the traditional reasons that it's cruel or unusual punishment in the traditional sense, but that it's really arbitrary. There's no real determination about whether or not somebody is executed because there's multiple victims or if it's an execution of a police officer. It really has to do with kind of the behind-the-scenes things about whether you get an attorney at the right time.
And where does that ruling stand now?
Right now it's being challenged, appealed in the Court of Appeal, and it is awaiting determination, but that could take months.
And part of the reason for this bill, as you mentioned, is this enormous cost of death penalty cases. A lot of that has to do with the long appeals process, in some cases taking 10, 15, even 20 years. Why does it take so long?
You know, the short answer is that you've got a very difficult system in place in California and in other states as well, but especially in California. The review process takes a very long period of time because there's very few people who can actually represent somebody on death row. And there's just a shortage of people who are able to take these cases.
And why the shortage? Is it qualifications?
It is, definitely. You have to be incredibly qualified and experienced to represent somebody on death row. I've been practicing for 15 years, and I'm nowhere near qualified to represent somebody on death row.
Do you think California voters this time around will overturn the state's death penalty?
You know, it's an interesting question, and I think one of the things that the voters are going to have to struggle with is if you've got this ballot initiative, a vote for the initiative is you saying that you would actually like some of the money that's being spent on these death row cases to go to police officers, to firefighters, to teachers. And I think even if you're a proponent of the death penalty, that might be something that interests you.
How much money are we talking about?
Well, you know, it takes about $2 to $3 million per case to actually prosecute, convict, and sentence somebody to death. So that is money that's not being spent on infrastructure or on other projects. And I think that's something, even if you're a proponent of the death penalty, that's something that you might be interested in.
All right, Alex Simpson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
UC Regents called for an overhaul of a proposed set of principles against intolerance. This is after feeling pressure from Jewish groups who want to spell out how that statement addresses anti-Semitism. UC is the first statewide university to consider adopting such a declaration. It wants all 10 campuses to be free from acts and expressions of intolerance of any ethnic or religious groups. Messages of support from around the nation for a 14-year-old Muslim boy handcuffed and suspended after bringing a homemade electronic clock to school. His teacher alerted police because she thought it was a bomb. No charges were filed. Police and school officials have not commented on the detention. The student says he plans on transferring to a private school.
Built a clock and got in a lot of trouble for it. I built the clock to impress my teacher, but when I showed it to her, she thought it was a threat to her. So it was really sad that she took a wrong impression of it, and I got arrested for it later that day.
President Obama is among his supporters on Twitter. He invited the teenager to the White House to show off his clock. The teen says he wants to attend MIT. Preparing for the Pope's first trip to the U.S., the White House plans on opening its back lawn to 15,000 people for his arrival next week. The pontiff plans on addressing a joint session of Congress. He will also canonize Father Junipero Serra ahead of his visit. A coalition of priests, nuns, and lawyers are urging the Pope to investigate the child protection records of American church leaders accused of shielding priests who sexually abuse children. Real estate data released today show a mixed picture in California. Fewer homes are entering the foreclosure process, but more are being seized by banks. RealtyTrack says bank repossessions are the final stage of the foreclosure process. They're up 30% from a year ago. They also say there's lingering inventory of homes tied to toxic mortgages from the last housing bubble. Cracking down on mini dorms in the college area. Mini dorms are single-family homes rented to multiple students. Many of them have become nuisance properties due to loud parties. The president of the college area community council says the old law was virtually unenforceable because it included conflicting definitions of rooming house.
That was eliminated through the modification that we recently had approved. It eliminated the duplicate definitions into one. That was approved by the fair housing advocates and by the city attorney's office. And now the code enforcement will have the tools they need to actually enforce the ordinance. Simple as that.
A rooming house is considered a single-family home that rents more than 2 rooms to different tenants. That's now illegal under the law. Homeowners can also be fined up to $1,000 for loud parties. San Diego has loosened restrictions on backyard beekeepers. The county supervisors voted unanimously today to allow hives to be kept closer to houses and roads. It's part of a new tiered beekeeping ordinance with different rules for hobbyists and commercial operations. Bees are an essential part of plant reproduction. Commercial beekeeping businesses pollinate almond, avocado, fruit, and seed crops. At 100 years, Balboa Park is ranked among the best in the world. Peggy Pico finds out why landscape prevention is important to the park's future.
With 1,200 landscaped acres and 15 major museums, Balboa Park is one of the nation's largest urban cultural parks. Of course, it's evolved since the park first opened, and the ongoing drought is taking its toll on the landscape. Here with a look at planning for the future is my guest, Charles Birnbaum, President and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation in Washington, D.C. And Charles, what is a cultural landscape?
Well, a cultural landscape, Peggy, is any landscape that has been affected by humankind. It can be a design landscape like Balboa Park. It can be a vernacular landscape like the vineyards and working landscapes that are nearby. Or it could be a landscape that's a historic site like the exposition grounds.
Well, you've studied parks all over the world. How does Balboa Park stack up?
Well, Balboa Park really is one of the great large urban parks in America. They brought a man from the East Coast, Samuel Parsons, to do a plan in the early 1900s. And what he created was a landscape that was picturesque in a way that it had never been done before, and it has a bigness like a national park. I think people, when they come here, think they must be in a national park, that they've never seen such big scenery in a city park before.
What really separates it? Is it the park with the architecture, or is it just the sheer size or the diversity of the plants?
Well, a lot of the architecture and the roads that have come in over time. I think Balboa Park really has three periods. There's the first period where it's picturesque, laying lightly on the canyons, working with the place. Then, of course, there's the Exposition of 1915, where it became about the Exposition, which is a National Historic Landmark. And then, of course, around 1960, it really starts to accelerate with automobiles and roads, more paving, more buildings. I think now the time, with large-scale planning and looking at public-private partnerships, there's a real opportunity to get back to the landscape and put the landscape first.
Now, about 6 million people visit the park every single year. What attracts so many people?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think, first of all, you know, Balboa Park is a local park, it's a regional park, it's an international designation. Its silhouette of its exposition buildings, I would say, are as iconic as the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben. People already have prepared themselves to come there. I think that's the easy part. I think the part today, in looking at this larger scale planning, is to understand the evolution of the park and the richness of all of its natural, cultural, scenic resources. Stuff that's been below the radar outside of the exposition grounds.
What do you think are the most important issues for the future facing the park?
I think balancing nature and culture. I think that, as you alluded to in your opening remarks about water, climate change, we're dealing with dramatic climate events these days. And I think one of the things we're seeing in a lot of other cities that are grappling with this is you can also deal with these things through the lens of understanding how a landscape has evolved. So in very much the way the park was originally planned, that it grows out of the place as opposed to being put on top of it.
As in specifically when we're talking to plants, let's say native plants, things like that?
Well, let's talk about Kate Sessions. One way to honor Kate Sessions is not putting a statue of her in the park. It's actually having Arbor Day festivals and planting trees in the parks, but also honoring the trees she planted that are now a century old that need water. Those historic trees are witness trees to the history of this city, and they're as important as any building in the park.
Let's talk about a bit of infrastructure, because as the park continues to grow in popularity, and it is a national and international destination spot, how do you accommodate for things and needs like parking?
Well, I think that one of the things we're seeing today, and Houston is a perfect example. You know, here's a place built on automobile culture, and now we're seeing civic gestures of the Beaux-Arts scale that we had with the exposition grounds here in Houston. We are burying roads, we're reimagining how we move people through landscapes, and what we're doing again is we're putting the landscape and the ecology first, and we're subordinating these other types of uses in the park, knitting together these wounds that have happened for more than a half century.
Now, Balboa Parks Committee estimates as there's a $300 million deferred maintenance, basically, that's needed for the park. How should the city pay for the upkeep as we're moving forward, not just for the landscape, but the park in general?
I think there's always this pressure to want new things. And then you often have people who are patrons who want to assert their vision in landscapes. It happens all around the world. My hope is that rather than looking at objects and individual moments going forward, that to actually realize a $300 million backlog, that the way to do that is with sound planning principles, building a very big tent, planning top down, bottom up, and having a comprehensive vision that puts the entire landscape first as a way to begin to excite people and re-engage them in a meaningful dialogue that's not just about individual things that are plopped and dropped in a park landscape.
Do you think it could be a sort of a public-private donor type of cooperation?
I think there's no question that whatever happens has to be public-private. I think one of the great things here is you're not having to have people fall back in love with the park. They're already in love. That romance never ended. So you're ahead of the game there.
All right, Charles Birnbaum, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peggy.
You can find more stories about Balboa Park online at kpbs.org/Balboa Park. It's part of our year-long celebration on the heart of San Diego.
I'm Gwen Eiffel on the next News Hour. Ahead of his U.S. visit, making sense of Pope Francis' critique of capitalism. That's Thursday on the PBS News Hour.
More than 100 dogs were rescued from slaughter. San Diego Humane Society today took custody of 29 of them as part of an international effort to save more canines from the Korean meat trade. These dogs may be up for adoption soon. The International Humane Society says it's working to help these farmers transition and find another way of making a living. Federal projections say by 2025, a quarter of the nation's K-12 students will be learning English at school while speaking another language at home. But researchers say these students are among the most poorly served and more likely to drop out. From our Fronteras desk, Simon Thompson reports on what some school districts are doing to bridge the bilingual achievement gap.
With a cabbie hat, full face shades and a fade haircut, bilingual Spanish rapper Guero Loco looks like the kind of guy you'd see hanging out the window of a lowrider or emceeing a reggaeton show. But today, he's working the stage at Deming High School in New Mexico, rapping through the Spanish alphabet to put some swagger into bilingual and Spanish learning.
Hip with the hip hop. It's, the youth, they really love hip hop. I mean, shoot, 50, 60-year-old people love hip hop now. So just really taking a music that they like, and then putting the rhythm and the repetition to good use.
Guero Loco uses hip-hop and reggaeton beats to lead students through the fundamentals of Spanish, the alphabet, vowel pronunciation, and verb conjugations, like in this instructional video.
Yo canto, yo canto, yo canto. Tú cantas, tú cantas, tú cantas.
Sitting in the back of the auditorium is Michael Chavez, the Director of Bilingual Education for Deming's Public Schools. He says he brought Guero Loco into the district just north of the US-Mexico border to raise the profile of dual language learning.
We service different kids within the program. We service English learners that are, of course, Spanish speakers that are learning English. And we're also trying to recruit more English speakers that want to learn Spanish.
In the last decade, Chavez says bilingual programs have had to do more with less federal funding. But he says bringing Guero to schools is money well spent. Students can relate to him and his experience. He's fluent in Spanish and knows his way around Mexican slang. But he is no native speaker.
Guero Loco basically means the crazy white guy, the crazy gringo, because my parents aren't Latino. I don't have anybody in my family that is Latino.
His real name is Steven Stiegelmeyer, born and raised in the suburbs of Indianapolis, where he almost failed Spanish in school.
For a lot of the gringo kids, I used to be in their position. I used to be sitting in their seats wondering, why am I taking this language? How is this ever going to help me out in my life? It's probably not, so why should I even pay attention? So my job is to be that link, is to come in and say, this is why.
One reason to pay attention? Better test scores. Researchers at Michigan State took a look at math and reading scores at Texas schools. Native English speakers did better at schools with bilingual education. Chavez says English language learners in the district's bilingual programs are also performing better in reading and math.
Well, there's a lot of people that believe that in order to learn English, you need to be in an all-English environment, and there's lots of research out there, and we've got data within our district that show that that English learners that are doing it through both languages, English and Spanish, are actually outperforming our kids that are not.
Despite the data, Deming High School sophomore and native Spanish speaker Cristina Hernandez says there's a second-class status attached to students in the bilingual Spanish tracks.
I see other people looking at other people like calling them, like, you're just Mexican.
Like most bilinguals, Hernandez was born in the US. She says it doesn't help that most bilingual classes at Deming High School are held off the main campus.
I feel like it's two different schools. We're at the same school, but it's like if we had two different schools.
Some kids like to pick on the kids from the bilingual classes, and they'll bully them. They'll say things to them that are disrespectful and sometimes even racist. And so what I want to do is be able to go and connect with those kids, the kids that are being pushed, the kids that are being bullied, and explain to them, don't ever feel shame in the fact that you're bilingual. You know, because sometimes they just get overloaded with them. They're like, you know what, I'm just going to reject my language. And they're rejecting this gift.
Chavez says the same pressures and the English-only emphasis cost him his native tongue when he was a Deming High School student in the 1970s. He says bringing Guerra Loco is one part of a coordinated campaign to ensure students' bilingual opportunities are not getting overlooked in the Deming district.
Escuchen estudiantes una vez más, one more time.
This year, Guerra Loco takes his message on the road to schools across the country.
For the Fronteras Desk in New Mexico, I'm Simon Thompson.
It's warming up in San Diego. 70s and 80s over the next couple of days along the coast. Some surfers at the Oceanside Pier reported seeing stronger waves this morning thanks to strong currents from the earthquake in Chile. A mix of sun and clouds in the inland valleys with 80s and 90s there. Plenty of sunshine in the mountain areas. We will head back into the 80s by Sunday. And triple digits once again in the desert areas. Of course, you can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. You have a great night.